After an incredibly long wait, Marvel Studios' Black Widow finally released, and after streaming it on Disney Plus, I decided to do my first ever movie review with this movie. And overall, I thought that it was pretty good. Similar to my video game reviews, I don't feel like doing a ton of different scores for this, so I'm just going to do a somewhat pros and cons list of what did and did not work for me with this movie. I will say that the main thing that I loved in this movie were the characters. In most Marvel movies, the side characters are usually pretty annoying and not very enjoyable. But in the case of this movie, that wasn't true at all. I actually really enjoyed pretty much all of the main cast as well as the side characters. The only exception being Black Widow's, I guess, friend who buys her a bunch of stuff at the beginning and end of the movie. And I don't feel like their relationship was established at all, and it was kind of confusing to me at least. But overall, I really enjoyed the characters, and the main one stealing the show was the character of Yelena, who kind of just played the little sister role while still being really funny in a lot of comedic scenes that happened. And also, the comedy was on point for this movie, which I wasn't expecting at all, considering that most Marvel movies that are kind of in this spy style, like this one was, usually have just kind of mediocre scripts. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily bad, but they definitely could have used a bit more work on them, but that wasn't the case for this one at all. I thought that the writing was pretty good. But while I enjoyed the writing and the script of this movie, it is also worth mentioning the plot, in which it is completely insane. This plot kind of felt like a Fast and Furious movie, but without all the focus on cars. There is a lot of chaotic action scenes that happen all throughout this movie, and I just found that to be increasingly fun. I think that the main thing that I loved about this movie, outside of the characters, were the giant explosive action scenes because, well, they were incredibly silly. The movie used this to its advantage, and I definitely appreciated that. Though I will say that some of the fight scenes had the common Marvel shaky cam, which kind of made them a bit disorienting. I don't know. I felt this a lot with Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but I would just prefer if the fight scenes just had one stable camera so I can fully see what's going on. Of course, that doesn't always work, but I just didn't really care for most of the fight scenes and kind of just preferred when it was over the top action instead. And this movie has a ton of that. There's a scene, I think, somewhere in the middle of the movie that's kind of like a Bourne Identity car chase scene. There's one at the beginning of the movie with a fight on a bridge, which was really cool and creative. And the prison break scene in the middle of the movie to try and get Red Guardian was also really awesome. And if you mix in the action scenes as well as really good characters, it definitely makes me care about them a lot more, which made me really like this movie. Though I will say that there are some tagged on motivations, and since the fight scenes are kinda troubling for me, it did lead to me liking this movie, well, not as much as I would have preferred. And while I do like a lot of the main and side characters, it is worth mentioning that Natasha doesn't really have a lot to do here as a character. They explain her backstory in a pretty engaging way, but I still feel like she should be doing a lot more. In some ways, she doesn't really feel like the main character of this movie, which is kind of weird since it's supposed to be her solo movie that she's finally getting all of these years later. But overall, I still think that this was a really enjoyable time. It definitely feels like a summer blockbuster with crazy action and just a lot of fun to it. I just wish it could have been a bit more. I mean, this movie was incredible, but definitely could have benefited from a bit more to it, I guess. And also, I think just more flashbacks in general. There's only a total of 2 in the movie, and I felt like there should have been 3 or 4, because there are some really cool moments where Natasha is just explaining things, and I feel like it would have been better if we saw those things instead of just her explaining them. But I will say that this was a really fun entry and definitely has me sold on Phase 4 of the MCU, if you even really want to call this movie that, since really the only part of this movie that is technically part of Phase 4 is the post-credit scene, and I guess that could be a small criticism towards the movie, that it kind of feels like it should have come out like 4 or 5 years ago instead of 2021. I mean, this does follow right after Civil War, but I wasn't really bothered by this, and I can't really see this as a giant complaint for the movie. So, honestly, I don't really care. I like to judge Marvel movies as if they're their own little story unless they are a direct sequel to something, and this one wasn't really a direct sequel, so I think it worked just fine. Overall, I did really enjoy this movie, but I felt like it definitely could have been better, but still a lot of fun. I'm going to give Marvel Studios' Black Widow a 7 out of 10.